Hello, I'm Alice Upton. I'm the Chief Executive Creative Folkestone, and I'd like to welcome you here today to Autumn Reads Modern Nature. This is our virtual festival in which we're bringing you a range of activities based around the diaries that Derek Jarman wrote at Prospect Cottage 1989 to 1990. We do hope you enjoy the festival, and we'd like to thank you for your continued support of Creative Folkestone.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Gale, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to Autumn Reads, presented by the Folkestone Book Festival. This is a programme of events designed to complement Derek Jarman's Modern Nature. I'm delighted to introduce our guest this afternoon, Hisham Matar. Hisham was born in New York City to Libyan parents and spent his childhood in Tripoli and then in Cairo, and he now lives in London. He is the author of 2 novels, In the Country of Men and Anatomy of a Disappearance, and 1 other work of non-fiction, The Return. The Return won a Pulitzer Prize, the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, and the Folio Prize, and was shortlisted for several more awards. His latest book is this marvelous book, A Month in Siena, a wonderful book which is, I think, a meditation both erudite and humble on art, on history, and the relationship between them. Having been interested in the great paintings of the Sienese School for more than 20 years, Hisham finally visited the Italian city, Siena, birthplace of these extraordinary works of art. This afternoon, we plan to discuss, among other things, I'm sure, Siena, Sienese art, and an encounter between a writer and a city. Hisham, welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
There's a very apt image, it seems to me, right at the beginning of A Month in Siena. You've just finished writing The Return, which has yet to be published. And you describe yourself finishing a long and concentrated period of work in your study, and then, as I quote, blinking into the light, which seems to me quite an apt image for your arrival in Siena when you finally do. And I wondered, could I invite you to cast your mind back to actually after you arrive in Siena, and then perhaps we'll talk about how you get there. But that first morning when you step out into Siena, can you recall that for us?
Yes, vividly. This is a place that I have had a very strong draw to for a long time. And over the years, because I've been so interested in these paintings that were painted there, and many of them, of course, reside there in the museums, I developed a slightly embarrassing phobia towards Siena. So I avoided it for many years. I found myself at times very near Siena, and I would deliberately not go there. Why? Because I wanted my first encounter with it to be an extended one. I didn't want to go for a couple of days or so. I wanted to go and stay for a while. And anyway, that happened with this trip, and so we arrive at night, and you can see, of course, but it was raining, but then that morning when you walk out and the city's all lit up, was just delightful. And Siena is in fact, Siena has sort of changed my view of what a city is in general. I think one way that we can look at our cities is as an interpretation of what life is. Every city is engaged in its own interpretation of how to organize human life. And Siena just does that because it's small and because it's so deliberate in its tactics, in its architectural tactics, extremely deliberate, very controlled. It just feels very concentrated. Its will, Siena's will, feels incredibly strong and vivid, when you're in it. Or at least that's how it felt that morning. Yeah.
You describe it, I think, at one point, you say it's a place both known and unfamiliar. which is something that struck me as very. An image that came to my mind was the first time I visited Paris, for example, late in life, in my 30s. And at one hand, I just thought, well, this just looks like a film set version of Paris, if you see what I mean. There was something almost over-familiar about it, it seemed to me. And it took me a while. It's only, I think, when one goes down the highways and byways and off the beaten track that one gets to know a place. Can you talk a bit more about that, how familiar and unfamiliar Siena was to you?
I think I know exactly what you mean. And it's slightly, if I understand you correctly, it's different from how it felt in Siena. So you're right, there are cities that are so photographed and painted, like Paris, like New York, like Venice, that you could make an argument that you actually, in order to arrive at Paris, New York, or Venice, you need a few days there before you actually arrive. Because once you get there, you're seeing reproductions or evocations of reproductions. I certainly felt that the first time I went to Venice. I thought, really, I couldn't see it through the memory of the paintings until a few days in. But with Siena, it wasn't like that. It wasn't because I had seen images. I actually don't recall seeing, and of course the paintings that I was interested in, they're not paintings of Siena. Those Sienese painters evoke, a little bit the buildings and so on, but they're really painting something else. But it felt more like when you meet someone and they seem strangely familiar to you or recognizable. As though I think some encounters, I think some people you meet and others you recognize, right? And it does feel like a recollection. And places sometimes are like that. It can feel uncanny. I mean, what I'm talking about did seem to me uncanny because I felt strangely remembered by it. And that doesn't happen often. So I meant it more in that way.
You have this lovely description of Il Campo, the central square, which of course isn't a square at all, and that's part of what's so fascinating about it. And you talk about being in Il Campo and being both individual, solitary, and conspicuous at the same time, which you link to the sort of fan shape of the square. Could you just talk a little more about that?
The Il Campo is designed in such a way, its shape, but also the way that the ground kind of dips and rises around it, that it's the only piazza or public square that I know of where it doesn't matter where you're on it, you can see everything and everyone. There is really no place to hide in it, and I just found that so interesting because whatever it is that happens to us in public, and I think given particularly in our age how we don't only spend a lot of time in private spaces, but now we spend a lot of time in virtual spaces.
Yes.
That we have, I think, lost an aspect of our acquaintanceship with what it means to be in a civic space, to be part of some kind of dance in a way. That's how it felt like, because your mere presence in the piazza alters things, even in a very, very subtle way. Yeah. And that dynamic relationship was fascinating to me. And I'm aware of it also on a less kind of on a more sort of mundane day-to-day level when I walk out on my street. Because you do realize that even the most modest residential street, you walk out and you realize that you're in a different space. You are in a public space, and those transitions are, to me, really interesting. And I studied architecture and worked as an architect initially, and it's always one of the things that attracted me to it is that architecture, of course, isn't about bricks and mortar. Architecture is about a question that I think literature asks too, which is, how to live,
Yeah.
and that architecture has an optimism that it thinks that it can actually try to answer that question, whereas literature is much more invested in the dynamic energy, intellectual dynamic energy that you can get from just engaging with that question rather than serving it or answering it. But that sort of transition from one room to another, from one building to another, from inside to outside, from a shaded, quiet space to a public lit space, is something we're all familiar with, and we take for granted, of course, because you can't be thinking about that all the time. But to me, it's such a really interesting aspect of what it means to be alive in a city, to live in a city.
Yeah. There's a very interesting exchange, a meeting you have with a woman in Il Campo. And I think you were going to maybe read a little from the book.
Yes, yeah. It's actually not in Il Campo, it's in the Duomo. But
yeah.
But yeah, it's. I thought to read this because hopefully, it will give an impression of an aspect of the book, but also the fact that this book arises out of a moment, like you said, Stephen, right out of a moment when I finished a book. So there's a strange sort of correspondence, I feel, between this book and the Return, the book before this. The following morning, the sun shone and I went out early. This is the time when I would usually write, and yet I had no sense of obligation that day. Every time I finished a book, I felt emptied by it, but I had never experienced this more severely than on completing my last, the one on my return to Libya and my failed search for my father. I sat opposite the Duomo, its facade blinding and icing white in the light. The square was empty. An elderly black woman walked across it. We greeted one another. She sat beside me, a polite distance away, and began talking in Italian. Quickly perceiving my handicap, she spoke with that generosity of outsiders, uttering each word clearly, gesticulating and looking me straight in the eyes. Her voice echoed easily against the buildings and the stone-slab floor of the vacant piazza, which, with no soul in sight, appeared uncertain in scale, as though it could have been significantly larger, or indeed smaller than it was. It seemed both a grand space and yet one as intimately private as a courtyard. What I gathered from what the woman told me was that she was originally from Nigeria, and that she had been living in Italy for 23 years and was now, finally, eligible for a passport. She pointed to a grand building to one side of the square. "That's the ministry," she said. "What will you do when you get your passport?" I asked. "Visit my country," she said, and in the silence that followed, she repeated, more to herself, "Yes, my country." Something about her made me think of my mother. I wanted to go to the Pinacoteca, the museum that houses several of the paintings I have, for so long now, been wanting to see. Lying in bed the night before, just before I fell asleep, I felt that rush of excitement I recognized from childhood, when knowing with trembling certainty that, as I lay in bed, the sea was still there and would continue to be there throughout the night and the morning too, when I would wake up. I had fallen asleep imagining those paintings in the darkened museum rooms of the Pinacoteca. But now, in the early morning, sitting in the square beside the woman who had been waiting nearly for as long as I have been wanting to visit Siena, to close to a quarter of a century, to return home, I felt it was not yet the right time to go to the paintings. I waited with the Nigerian lady until the ministry opened. I wished her luck. She placed a hand on my cheek and thanked me. Her skin felt cool and dry. We embraced, and I watched her until she entered the building. I walked on and watched the city wake and busy itself. I followed several individuals from a distance. I told myself that I was undertaking this strange and disreputable activity in order to see how locals navigated Siena, to catch a glimpse of their daily lives, to live, as it were, in their wake. But the truth was simpler, more bodily than intellectual, more to do with the rhythm, more to do with rhythm than ideas. I simply wanted, like a stonemason grinding his chisel on a rough slab, to sharpen myself against the city. I followed a man to his place of work. From about 15 meters away, I trailed a woman and her young boy. When they arrived at his school, she stood a long time watching him through the gates until he entered the building. She remained there for a minute or two, looked up, presumably at the window of his classroom. I followed her to another address and left when she entered an unmarked building.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a lovely exchange. It's a lovely exchange. To what extent do you think that the woman, she wanted somebody to witness her going to collect the passport?
I don't know if she wanted a but perhaps. I never thought of it that way. Perhaps. I think she, the way I think about it is that she seemed anxious, and I was maybe a distraction, from that anxiety. But I also have found that exactly because I had gone, as it were, to find my solitude, because one of the things I think the book is about is how our relationship to things alters when we're alone. So there's a description in the book how suddenly time seems to change.
Yes.
And it seems that that I've got that to be alone is to be looking out of two windows at the same time, one looking backwards and one looking forwards, one looking to the past, one looking to the future, and how that altered my state of mind, but also my relationship to the paintings. And also, I think it turned out, I didn't go there for that, at least consciously for that reason, but it turned out that I wanted a state of emergence. I wanted to put myself in a place where things can rise up to the surface. Not least of all, the inescapable seemed to me then, inescapable fact that my father, who was a political dissident who had been abducted and disappeared. He's counted amongst the disappeared. And when I went to Libya, I went to look for him in part. And this moment when I go to Siena is the moment when my efforts have been exhausted, and the probability that I will have to live the rest of my life not knowing what happened to my father became incredibly strong and probable. And so I think one of the things that was going on there is me contending with that, contending with that. And so the book is also a space for that, and the solitude was necessary for that. But as soon as that space of solitude was made, there are a couple, only two or three, actually three, encounters with complete strangers in the book that are quite magical in their own way, very kind of unexpected, magical in that way. This is the most fleeting one. The other ones are more deeper engagements, and wonderful, really. Yeah.
There's a very moving section where you're laying down in a square, and you're thinking about your father speaking Italian to you when you're a small child, and you say at one point, "The pupil excelled the teacher," and it seems to me this encapsulated this sense of you of moving on, There's to some extent an acceptance that you may never know what happened to your father. Would that be correct?
Yes, I think that's correct, and I think moving on here is also not only in the obvious ways, but also I think the uncertainty that surrounded the fate of my father acted as a kind of captivating circumstance. I mean, literally captivating. Not only captivating my thoughts, but literally captivating me, and that I was captive. And so it's also moving on in that sense. I think trying to, a very very strange thing happened. I realized that his absence was at the center of everything. And I think what has occurred over the years is that I allowed myself to move into the center of things. And I think that's the moment when as well as the liberation that comes with that, there's also the necessity to contend with the loss. And I think the paintings, or looking at the paintings, was part of that. And it turns out that this strange habit of mine of visiting the same painting over an extended period of time happened or started the year my father was abducted in 1990. And from this perspective, it seems obvious that at a moment of absence, of disappearance, of inarticulacy, of no news, of no communication, that you go to paintings because they are appearing. They're the opposite of a disappearance, and they're the opposite of inarticulacies. There's nothing more available than a great work of art. It's always there. It's always working. It's on the wall, but it's working all the time. It's doing its work, and it's not as sort of glib as saying I found consolation in these paintings. It's not like that.
No.
But I found activity. I found vibrancy and activity, and I think this is why I'm, as much as I myself love to be entertained and distracted by art, and I go to it for those reasons too. I want to be delighted, and why not? But I lament the fact whenever I sense that our culture has decided that is the place for art, because actually it's much more than that. It is really a space of activity. It's the space where human expression is at its most articulate and vibrant and truthful, I think. I mean, at its best, of course.
You mentioned that you have visited the paintings at the National Gallery since 1990. Does renewed viewing of a picture change your perception of it over time?
Yes, certainly. Back then I would do it every week. Like I would go to the same picture on my lunch break and stand in front of it for 20 minutes or something for a week. And then, so the ordering mechanism of how I switched from picture to picture was just to do with that week. Whereas now it's to do with when I lose interest maybe, or I just feel that I've exhausted my curiosity for now, and then I move on. And that could take months. It often does take months. And yes, I find it's one of the best ways to describe it for me. It's like a really good conversation. When you meet a friend or somebody that you really, and as we know with relationships, that we are slightly different. With the people that we know, and we talk about different things, and they lend to us when it's really working. They lend to us the exercise of their sympathies, concerning particular subjects, and we find ourselves, depending, more eloquent or less eloquent. Isn't it a mystery sometimes how you're with someone and you might love them and you know that they care a lot for you, but there's something about them that makes you less articulate, less lucid somehow.
Yeah.
And then with others, you are much smarter than you are on your own. When you're with them, you just see, and it's the same with paintings. A great painting can tease out perceptions in you that nothing else does. And that conversation becomes elaborate over time. And but this is just to be clear about this, Stephen. Is I'm not convinced that after months of looking at the same painting that I've necessarily know it any better than someone else who looked at it for 5 minutes. It's not, and that's part of the thing that I love about the mystery of looking at a painting. Because paintings are very deceptive. I mean, they're explicit. They're there, hanging on the wall. What's to say that if you saw it for 5 minutes, or I saw it for 5 months, been going to see it for 5 months, that I've somehow, it's to me that's uncertain now.
I'm very taken with that suggestion of not seeing it better. Do you feel there's a difference between if a person is viewing a painting, two people are viewing a painting, one of whom has a good deal of art historical knowledge and the other doesn't?
I don't know. I mean, it depends. Sometimes knowledge becomes a barrier. It becomes a filter, like an organizing mechanism. I think we've seen people like that who have learned a code, and they use the code to filter things through it. But I think genuine knowledge would of course expand things. But I have a real enthusiasm for the gesture of the dilettante, of the one that goes to something that they feel they have absolutely no authority on it. Yeah. They don't know anything about opera, and they go and they should just give themselves the freedom to engage with it with the spontaneity and the playfulness that it deserves, because I think ultimately, at its best, great art is I think Picasso says that all children are artists, and I think there's something about great art that has, not that it's childlike, but it has that availability. It's not interested in translation or in having some mediator that's going to sort of decode it. But that's not to say that when something grabs your interest, that it also places demands on us, doesn't it? When a work of art grabs our enthusiasm, I think the demands are to know it better, to know what the circumstances that it arose from, perhaps, and of course every case is different. But no, I don't necessarily think that. And one of the reasons I look at paintings this way is because, and I'm not saying this as a, I don't know, hyperbole or exaggeration. I mean it literally. I really look at paintings this way because I still don't know how to look at a painting. I don't know how to look at it. It's still, to me, an open question. How do you look at a painting? Just like it is, to me, an open question, what does it mean to read a book? Because there are books that I've reread in such a way that I am momentarily convinced that there's no such thing as reading. There's only rereading, and then I've read things for the first time, and I felt that exactly because I'd read it for the first time, I had some kind of window onto it was open. So that question is also open to me. Yeah. Yeah.
You, when you arrived in Siena, your wife Diana accompanied you. I'm just thinking what you're saying about how well one knows other people. I was with you for a few days. Actually, as you put it, she delivered you there, left you there.
For 2 days, and she went back.
Just to ask you is there a difference between what you experience and appreciate together, a shared experience, between your then individual experience after she has left Siena?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's something that that we are both interested in. Actually, this mystery, no, of how when we are together we experience things in a different way than when we are alone. Um, Not better and not worse, just different. The the things that I notice and think about when I'm with her are different than the things that I notice and think about when I'm alone. And I am also, we both are actually, uh, of the belief that there are certain things that are only possible when you're alone. You know, and and a certain kind of register of attention, I think. Not necessarily deeper, although it can be, but it's not necessarily deeper. Yeah.
You talk about. I'm going to ask you: is a painting as a substitute for writing? You talk at the beginning when you arrive in Siena. As we've mentioned already, you've recently finished writing this intensive period of concentrated work on the return, and you use a phrase. You say, if I remember correctly, that you say you arrived in Siena. I was under no obligation to write, and I'm very interested in this idea of writing as an obligation, and whether, to some extent, your experience of Siena and of the art is a substitute for that.
It's. I mean, I don't have in the bigger sense. I don't have an obligation towards my vocation. In other words, I'm not a careerist. At least I don't think I am. I don't write because it's my job. But I do have. I am interested in work. I do like working. I do like making something and thinking about something and having its demands on me. At its best, writing deepens and curates your enthusiasms. That's at its best, and I enjoy that. And also, I've just not been I'm not very good at taking time off. I don't know what that looks like. I think of myself as somebody that is not hindered towards his pleasures. So I'm all for going to the sea and going quote unquote on holiday. But I can't go on holiday in the sense of stopping. I just don't know how to do that. So I'm anchored in some way by my work, and I think what was peculiar about this month in Siena is that it was really the first time in my life when I stopped writing. And yes, maybe you're right in the sense that I needed something else to hold my attention. And the paintings did that. Yeah.
You didn't, when you arrived, you didn't immediately rush to see the paintings.
Yeah.
You're almost rationing them, and obviously, as we discussed already, these are works of art with which you are familiar to an extent, but have not yet seen these. Can you explain that rationing, that delaying, that sort of eking it out?
I have I think it's particularly with certain levels of privilege, right? If you have, if you can afford your own home, if you have some money that gives you certain levels of security and allows you leisure and stuff. Basically, in a country like Britain, an overwhelming number of people have these privileges, and which we think of as just daily life. But I think one of the things that they've done is that they've made us much more able to secure our what we think we want, and so we are very systematic about the things that we want to do. I'm sorry to speak in such stupid general. This is a stupidly generalized statement, but it's become. It seems to me that it's become normal, and it's not actually been the case for forever. It's a new phenomenon that, relatively speaking, a new phenomenon that we all think we know what we want and we go and get it. I'm going on holiday now to Paris and I know exactly what I want. I'm going to visit X, Y, and Z. That kind of sort of deliberateness, I am suspicious of.
Yeah.
I actually don't want to be driven entirely by my intentions. Of course, certain things I want my intentions to drive me, but so I'm all for that kind of travel where you go to a place and you don't look at the list of things that you should do. You just give yourself a space to find, to discover, and be free of the obligation that, I have to see all the sites. I mean, how many holidays have been ruined by that? This obligation sort of tick boxes, and so I had a general idea that I wanted to see these paintings, and I had a general idea that I want to be there for a month, but I wanted it to be open. Yeah.
I think living as a flaneur, I suppose, is one of life's great pleasures. It seems to me. I've frequently returned home from a holiday, and friends interrogate me on where I went and did you see this thing and did you go to that thing? And no, I just wandered around. And people just understand this at all. They find this very difficult to comprehend.
Yes, and also, I mean, it's not, of course, to that attitude or that way of being in a place is not, of course, only to do with travel. It's also the way we live, the way we walk. And I bumped into a friend the other day who was coming back from work through the park, and I was walking through the park, and he looked at me and he said, you're here, what do you do? Are you exercising? I was just I had no answer actually for what I was doing, because I was finding out what I was doing. I had no clue.
There's a lovely moment quite late on in your time in Siena when a friend of yours who lives not too far away discovers you're there. Is not best pleased that you haven't told her that you're.
No, she's very close. Yeah.
And she's celebrating a birthday party. And wants you to go, and you're very reluctant, it seems to me. And it seems to me, just picking up on what you're saying, it's partly because this is like a return to structure, whereas you've got used to being solitary and wandering around, in particular when you visit that cemetery and things like that. Would that be true?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, I had carved this, which I already have doubts about that, carving a space, and but I that's what I did, and I wanted to guard it, I didn't want to function under any obligations, but it was interesting also to once she did win and I did go for a couple of days, how it changed, how I felt I was changed by the time I'd spent in Siena, but also how when I returned to Siena I felt the magic had been interrupted a bit. And but I think one of the things that the book is thinking about is exactly that relationship, how to be available to certain emotions and certain ideas and certain paintings, but also to people at the same time. And that's not always possible to do all that at once.
Yes. It's one of the things I wondered if we could talk about a little, which is, the Sienese School as was roughly 150 years, 13th to 15th century, but of course is interrupted by the Black Death, by the plague.
Yes.
And I wondered if we could talk a little about the pandemics and the plague. Now, to what extent do you think, many of the artists were wiped out in the 1340s, 1348 in particular. And of course, they had their workshop, they had their apprentices, and there was and when things pick up again, the growth of the church, of the influence of the church, is considerable. But could we talk a little bit, what do you think was the effect on the art of the play?
Yeah, no, I think it's really a very, it's such an interesting moment. And it was inescapable for me to think about and to write about it because, you know, the Black Death, so-called because of the blotches that it left on the victim's body, was just, I mean, it's the most devastating single event in human history. And when you count how many people it killed, it on average, it killed, you know, 45% of the population of every country in the non-medieval world. And what it did to Sienese art is that it dismantled this incredible industry of artists' apprenticeship and workshops and so on. And it made the church incredibly powerful. And Siena lost its kind of quasi-democratic structure, you know, with its magistrates and you know that became very, very weak after that. In fact, it collapsed a few years after the plague, and the church became the dominant figure. And it also made the church more powerful in the sense of that, literally power and money in the state, but it also powerful in people's minds because many people, the majority of you know, the medieval Christian world thought of the plague as, you know, as punishment from God.
Yes.
And lots of, you know, Petrarch wrote about it and said that it was so, and so many other poets. And so coming back from the other side, what you get is paintings that are anxious about pleasing the church, but also anxious about death.
Yes.
Death itself became a vivid thing. And, you know, Michelangelo in one of his letters to Vasari says, you know, I see the face of death on everything, you know. And I think that quality, you know, modernism, wherever you choose to mark it, you know, in painting, it becomes, you know, it wouldn't have happened without this terrible event. So when you look at the paintings of, you know, all those great figures of the Renaissance afterwards, part of what's going on in those paintings is this vivid awareness of it. You know, not that it's always uppermost in the mind, but it's there. It's in the shadows of Caravaggio. It's in the instability of Titian, you know, as well as joy and vividness and life. But there's also this dark temperament. So that really changed things.
Yeah, you say at one point, I think it's the imagination began to focus on the end of things.
Yeah.
Which I think
Yeah, and I think we are still the children of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can make a direct line to our fantasies, you know, in the present, particularly when you look at our science fiction fantasies, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
You quote is Ibn Khaldun, the Tunisian historiographer, who was active at this time, at the time of the pandemic. And you suggest he has a fairly sort of Darwinian reading of plague in history, obviously before Darwin, in which it is a sense of it can bring about a sort of a cultural and an artistic renewal. I think, if I've understood that correctly. Could you talk a little more about that? I found that really fascinating.
I mean, Ibn Khaldun, you know, the father of sociology, really, is caught in a very precarious position, because I think by temperament and by intellect, he is optimistic, by which I mean he is interested in, or functions under the belief that you could uncover a system behind human development.
Yeah.
And he was interested in large questions such as, how do you write a history? How do you, where do you start? How do you devise a system to look at causality? And his introduction, al-Muqaddimah, which was meant to be just an introduction, ended up being his masterpiece, and it's a wonderful book. And so this is, if you like, his temperament. But then, at very close quarters, he witnesses how the Black Death dismantles, everything that he knows. It kills his mother. It kills his father. It shakes up the order, the social and political order all around him. And for as far as the eye can see, it's not just where he is, but everywhere else. And, he was a great traveler. And so he tries to grapple with it. And one of the ways that he attempts to think about it is that it had come not as medieval Christendom believed as punishment for sin, but rather has come at a moment when human civilization had grown weak. So the disease is not only in physiological, literal terms, succeeded because the human body couldn't defend itself against it, but society itself had somehow lost its way. And so he sees it as a moment that is both a symptom of social ill but also a moment where society might learn from that and grow into a much more coherent, committed to science and committed to social orders that were more coherent. That's how I read those responses of his.
Could I, if I may, could I put you on the spot a little? Just thinking about thinking about our current circumstances now. We're in the pandemic. What do you think might be the influence of our current situation, the current pandemic, specifically on the imagination?
That's it's a question that I think about a lot. I think we all are, aren't we, thinking about it? I think the obvious thing to say is that this isn't the Black Death, meaning there's a question of scale, of course. But it's exactly because of the Black Death that it wakes up things in us that I think we remember without even knowing. So even if you don't know anything about the Black Death, we are part of a culture. We are all connected to one another in some ways that are obvious and not obvious. And our memory is alive. And everything that has happened to human history is in some way, I believe, evident in our life, even if we have forgotten it. And part of the anxiety and fear and that arises in us towards the COVID-19 disaster is rational, and at the same time part of an age-old memory that reminds us bitterly of how vulnerable we are. But I think it also reminds us that we are part of nature. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think I never thought we would be at risk of forgetting, but something about our culture and about our technology and the way that we function has put us at that risk. I think it was 2007 when the majority of the inhabitants of the planet are now living in cities. Yes. So we have a crisis in the way that we deal with our planet, in ecological sense, but we also have a crisis in the imagination of how we think about the planet. For example, it shows itself up even in the language that we use. I always, for example, thought it was inaccurate to say that there's the crisis of the environment, or it seems it's a human crisis. It's not, the environment will outlast us, the planet will outlast us, but it's a human. So even in that sort of way that we describe it seems to signal something about how inexact we are in that relationship. Yeah. And so I wonder, and I hope also that this terrible event, COVID-19, maybe will remind us on some level that we're part of nature again. But I think it also there's a risk of it disrupting or disfiguring at least an aspect of our imagination, because it is making it very difficult for us to live as social beings. It's making it difficult for us. It's actually inviting us into a space that I've always loathed politically, whenever the political conversation is talking about how we might be infected by one another, how the foreigner is going to come in and do this. And, and this conversation about COVID, of course, has made us all, in real, rational terms, worried about being infected by one another or harming one another by, exposing a vulnerable person in case we might have it and so on. So those, I think, are real risks to our imagination. But I'm really hopeful, because there's just, there are many people who have behaved badly, but there's just the overwhelming, it seems to me we are overwhelmingly behaving well, people, there's just a great deal of kindness, and it never ceases to amaze me how every day people in small acts choose to do something that isn't in their self-interest, but that is good in some way. And this time has really shown that, notwithstanding, in my view, the shortcomings of the many governments, not just our government here.
It strikes me that it's a time we're being reminded of our ever-increasing interconnectedness. And it seems that what is critical, and we will discover, is whether that we embrace that interconnectedness or, of course, reject it. And I think that's the danger I think you're alluding to as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I just think, we are so deeply connected in ways that are not only to be celebrated, in my view, but in ways that need to be expanded and deepened. I feel that our need to be more socially fluent is just crucial right now for us, really, really crucial. Not only for the obvious reasons, which is that we're all interconnected and dependent, and there's just a lot of movement around, and the shape of our societies and of the world is such that it can't be reversed. It has to be engaged with thoroughly and honestly, and with the sort of patience and genuine curiosity and respect that is required. And that is a serious invitation. I don't say it lightly. So it's obvious. It seems you understand why people shirk from it and want to do something else and want to reverse the clock, but it's not possible right now.
Yes. Yeah. I'd like I may just ask you one more question. Sort of, to some extent, coming back full circle. How do you think, when the pandemic is over, should it be over, when you return to the National Gallery and you look at these paintings, how do you think your perception might have changed?
Well, I feel I can answer that with some level of insight, because it happened. It's closed, and then it reopened, and now it's closed again. And when it closed, I found it very, very, really interesting, not in the positive sense, but interesting in the sense that it was revealing And I wrote a piece about it for the New York Times Magazine because two pictures came to mind that you would never put next to each other. These photographs by a little-known German photographer, World War II German photographer called Willy Ruge, probably pronouncing it wrongly. It's R-U-G-E, his last name. And he took these strange photographs parachuting, so in midair. And they're all about this sort of connectedness to the earth and not being connected to the earth. And then that very famous painting of Gainsborough's daughters in the National Gallery, this, a painting that I've walked by many times and not really looked at. For some reason, those two pictures came together, and I wanted. And the other reason I wrote that piece is because it became very vivid to me then that those paintings locked, away in the National Gallery with the lights off, was itself an event.
Yeah.
That in other words, paintings are working in our culture all the time.
Yes.
They're working on us all the time, and they're changing the way we look and think. And once you close them, that dynamic relationship stops, and we suffer from it. So. But then when the museum reopened and I went back, and of course it's very controlled, as you know, and you have to make an appointment, and the people working are just so wonderful and really keen, that everybody comes back. And but you're with much fewer people. So all that stuff that used to annoy us, when you go to an exhibit like this wonderful Titian exhibit that they've got there, and you have somebody standing in front of you, somebody behind you. I missed that. I missed it. I didn't realize that I actually enjoyed that. I enjoyed the silent attention of a complete stranger looking at the same thing I'm looking at. And of course, because we're human beings, they're seeing something totally different from what I'm seeing.
Yes.
And even little things, this might sound perverse, but I even missed the smell of these people, how you're standing next to somebody and you could just catch a whiff of their of their cologne or something. Even the presence of someone. I missed all of that, and I didn't actually enjoy what I thought I would enjoy, which is, now I've got the whole room to myself. No, not at all. I actually felt it was quite that. In other words, to put it very simply, it illuminated the fact to me that museums in a public space is not only a positive thing for the obvious reasons, giving us free access to these great works of art and so on, and that we, like all of us, we go to these places in the beginning not wanting to go, and or not thinking we want to go, and then we discover something. And so not only for that fact, but actually there's a very strong argument for great works of art to be available in a public space, because that is the place where they will be most active. More people will see them, and the painting itself will be more active, and we will be more responsive to it. So it's increased my passion even more for free access to museums. Yeah.
Hisham, it's been a great pleasure talking with you this afternoon. And again, please, congratulations on a wonderful book. A Month in Siena is really a terrific read. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for the attention you've given my work and your questions. And also thanks to the Festival of Folkestone. I hope next time I'll be able to come in person.